Backwoods Paranormal Presence. Do you remember? Episode 9. The Talking Phone Book and the Wrestling Report. Do you remember when you could pick up the telephone, dial an 800 number, and actually listen to somebody tell you what was happening in the world? Before the internet, before smartphones, before YouTube, there were those strange little services hidden inside the telephone system. And if you grew up in the 1980s, you might remember finding them in the phone book. You'd flip through the pages of that big, heavy telephone book looking for advertisements, businesses, and sometimes those little numbers that promised recorded information. One of the most interesting things you could find was a number where you could call and listen to a wrestling report. For a kid who loved professional wrestling, that was pretty exciting. You'd pick up the phone, dial the 800 number, and wait. Then you'd hear the recorded voice telling you about the latest wrestling news. You didn't have to wait until the next wrestling program came on television. You didn't have to wait for a magazine to come out. You could actually call the number and hear an update. Back then, that seemed like high technology. Today, we can pull out a phone and instantly search for anything. But in the 1980s, information didn't work that way. If you wanted to know something, you had to find it. You had newspapers. You had magazines. You had television. You had the radio. And sometimes, you had an 800 number. There were recorded services for all kinds of things. Sports information, weather, jokes, horoscopes, movie information, and other things that seemed almost magical to a kid who didn't understand how the system worked. You'd dial the number, and suddenly a voice would come through the telephone. It was like the phone itself knew things. And of course, if you were a wrestling fan, you were going to call that wrestling report as often as you could. You wanted to know who was fighting who. You wanted to know what was happening with your favorite wrestlers. And you definitely wanted to know what was coming up on the next wrestling program. Back then, wrestling was different. You couldn't just pull up a website and see every match, every result, and every rumor. You had to wait. That waiting made everything more exciting. You'd talk about wrestling with your friends at school. You'd argue over who was the toughest wrestler. You'd talk about the latest match you had seen. And if somebody had information you hadn't heard yet, they were the source of the latest news. Sometimes you might even call the number just because you were bored. You'd sit there holding that telephone receiver to your ear, listening to the recording. Then you'd hang up. A few minutes later, you'd pick it up and call again. Because maybe they had updated the report. Maybe something new had happened. Looking back, it seems funny. But at the time, it was exciting. The telephone wasn't just something you used to call grandma or your friends. It could be your connection to information that you couldn't easily find anywhere else. And that big telephone book sitting in the house was almost like an early version of the internet. You'd flip through those pages searching for something interesting. Businesses, restaurants, doctors, phone numbers, advertisements. And sometimes you'd stumble across something that made you say, "Hey, listen to this." You'd tell your friends about the number. Then they'd call it. And before long, everybody knew about it. That's one of the things I remember about growing up. We didn't have everything instantly. We had to hunt for information. And because we had to work a little harder to find it, sometimes the simplest things became memorable. A telephone, a phone book, an 800 number, and a recorded wrestling report. That was enough to keep a kid entertained. Today, if you want to know what's happening in wrestling, you can find out in seconds. But back then, you picked up the phone, you dialed those numbers, and you listened. So, do you remember the talking phone book and those old 800 information numbers? Do you remember calling to hear the wrestling report? Do you remember discovering other strange recorded services? And do you remember how amazing it seemed to hear information coming through the telephone? Because sometimes the things we remember most aren't the big events. Sometimes they're the little things. A telephone sitting on a table, a giant phone book beside it, a finger dialing an 800 number, and a recorded voice on the other end, telling you the latest wrestling news. That's another little piece of the past that we shouldn't forget. Do you remember? Episode 9. The Talking Phone Book and the Wrestling Report.